Hello everyone and welcome to another casual review. Today we're talking about Forspoken. In Forspoken, you assume the role of a 21-year-old girl named Frey. And Frey is a down-on-her-luck girl living in New York. She is an orphan, she's gotten mixed up in crime and has a criminal record, is basically homeless, and just overall not having a great go of it. Some story unfolds and Frey finds herself teleported into a high fantasy world called Athia. She is also permanently bonded to this arm brace type of jewelry that's wrapped around her arm, and it can speak to her. She promptly starts calling this thing Cuff, and he prefers the name Vambrace, and he's basically like your companion for the entire adventure in the world of Athia. Unfortunately, Athia is covered in this corruption that Frey calls the Break, and any humans or creatures that are left in the Break for too long start turning into these zombie-like monsters. There is one last safe haven where all of the humans reside in, but they're basically like surrounded by the Break, and there's not much hope for them. I will say that the very beginning of this game is a pretty slow burn. You're going to have to go through maybe an hour's worth of content before you really get into the nitty-gritty of the gameplay here. It is an open world game, although I would say that it is one of the shorter open world games that I have played, especially because I didn't try to 100% complete everything. For combat, you will be using 100% spells. So you're basically playing as a magic caster, which is pretty unique because more often than not, when you're playing a high fantasy game like this, you're going to be playing as majorly like some kind of knight with a sword or a melee weapon of some kind, and magic usually takes the backseat unless it is the type of game where you can like specifically tailor your character to be a caster. And so I will give this game high points for really setting itself apart in terms of the combat system. We're relying entirely on magic. At the beginning of the game, you only have access to a certain amount of spells here, and it's basically, I like to imagine this as earthbending, if you've ever seen Avatar: The Last Airbender. And so Frey's earthbending, you have a lot of unique abilities. For your spells, you basically have your regular like pea shooter, and then you can charge it and do a certain attack, and there's some customization here in terms of like what kind of attack you want to tie in to your basic pea shooter. And then you also have more unique spells that are on a cooldown. There's no type of like spell resource, there's no type of mana in the traditional sense, and so the only thing that's really holding you back from using your stronger spells are these cooldowns. As you progress through the game, you are going to basically acquire different types of spells, different elements, if you will. Because across the land of Athia, there are these really powerful women who have been corrupted by the Break called the Tantas, and it kind of works like a Mega Man thing where after you defeat a Tanta, then you kind of like absorb their magic. Eventually you are going to get access to like firebending, and this kind of more focuses on like melee type of attacks, and eventually you are going to get access to like water spells and then electric spells. My gripe about this type of spell releases and introducing you to new types of spells is I felt like you didn't get the water and the electric type of magic until fairly late in the game, and so you don't have a lot of opportunities unless you go out of your way, like completely walk away from the main story to play around with these new spells that you unlock. And so I wish that they had introduced all four of these different types of spells earlier into the game, and so you really had time to master it, pick out your favorites. There's also kind of like a skill tree for each different types of spells, and so as you level up, you are going to get, it's called mana, and you spend this mana in order to unlock new spells, unlock new traversal abilities, and unlock different types of crafting. And so it would have been nice if I had time to play around with all four of these different skill trees and really nailed down a type of play style that suited me best. I want to say for at least a third of the game, you only have access to Frey's basic earthbending type of spells. Now, I I mentioned that this is an open world game, so you're going to be traversing across huge plots of land. Unfortunately, most of the time the land is pretty barren and there is not a lot of interesting things in it. Like, granted, it does do the open world thing where go to this location and defeat these many guys and you'll get a stat upgrade to your magic or your health or whatever. Or there's like chests that are scattered throughout the land that you can find different crafting equipment. There are these like maze-like dungeons that you can explore and you get new equipment, mostly being you can have different cloaks and different necklaces that can affect various abilities and stats. The boxes themselves, you can find these chests where you have to kind of solve this moving puzzle to unlock, or you can just spend your hard-earned mana in order to immediately unlock it, which I had to do a couple times. And so for about half of the game, I was enjoying myself, traveling across these vast lands and gathering new gear and upgrading my character, but eventually it all just kind of felt like it wasn't giving me any major upgrades as far as my character went, and so I started doing these side stuff less and less and less. In order to cross through this barren land, you are going to be doing something that the game itself calls magic parkour. And so you're going to be using your magic to run super fast, hop along the walls. Eventually you can kind of like grapple yourself to certain ledge points and swing around. And in theory, this sounds really, really fun, like Spider-Man traversal level fun. Unfortunately, I just don't think that the execution of this was the best. It always felt kind of clunky whenever I'm using my magic parkour and I approach like a small little ledge. I'll do a jump up away from it instead of just kind of vaulting over it. And so as I did get better with this traversal system as I played along, and there are some kind of cool things that you can unlock. Like there's one where if you jump when you're running, then you kind of like vault yourself forward. So it's fun to just continuously vault yourself forward. And the grappling hook ability is kind of fun swinging along the ledges, but it never felt like perfect. You know, I think that they could have made this traversal system a little more seamless, because it just kept, Frey just kept wanting to vault away from the walls, and so I really just tried to like stick to really flat land, because vaulting off the walls completely broke any type of momentum that I would be gathering as I'm running across these fields. It is unfortunate that most of the land is pretty barren and boring. Like, I understand that the land is covered in the break, and so you want it to look pretty bleak and helpless, but that doesn't mean that you can't provide interesting environments, like maybe even just like colorful jungles or even icy areas. It's, for the most part, it really is just kind of like deserty or just plains environment, and I really think they could have mixed it up here. Like, granted, you have like the floating rocks up in the distance and things like that, but yeah, they could have just made it a little more exciting traversing across these open worlds, or maybe they could have tightened it up a little bit so there's not just such vast amount of distance between unique points of interest. In addition to gathering loot and defeating enemies and leveling up, collecting mana, there are these familiar monuments, and it's quite obvious from the very beginning of the game that Frey loves cats, and eventually you are going to encounter these familiars, which are cats with like sometimes wings or unicorn horns or different like mythical type of appendages, and you can kind of like slowly walk up to them and befriend these familiars, and they'll kind of like follow you as you're traversing across the open world. They have these safe houses that you can visit where you have time to craft your resources or upgrade your gear, and you can kind of see the familiars that you befriended just lounging around. This doesn't do anything gameplay wise, but it is a fun feature I found. I never found a way to like pick and choose what familiar I want to follow me around, but it is still, you know, it's kind of fun cosmetic wise. It probably also is just in your best interest to run around this world and explore, because you can actually find these light pools of mana just to collect and upgrade your gear that way. You can also find different like runes, different nail painting techniques, and depending on like how you paint your nails will affect your spells, which I think is a cool feature. So you have like a set on one hand and a set on another, so you can kind of like mix and match in that way. One of the slightly annoying things about just exploring and doing all this side content, upgrading your character, is the repeating banter between you and Cuff. At the beginning, I actually found that the banter between these two characters to be very charming because Frey, she's very brash. She's a 21-year-old orphan living in New York. She's going to swear a lot. She's kind of going to talk the way that we would in New York. And then she has to explain to Cuff what these terms and euphemisms mean. And so I found it charming at first, but this thing got old really, really fast. For one, a lot of these lines tend to repeat. So, for instance, you find a monument that you destroy all the corruption on it and you get like 5 extra HP. And every time you approach one of these monuments, Frey's like, huh, what's this? And Cuff is like, oh, I'm not entirely sure. Careful now. And it's like the exact same things. And like every time you defeat a group of enemies, Cuff will make an offhanded comment and then Frey will reply with a snarky reply. And this sounds charming because I do like the banter between these two characters, but at least make more lines because it repeats a lot. I know one of the main complaints that I do hear about this game online is people just don't like Frey as a character. They don't like the way that she talks, and I will admit that her dialogue is pretty corny. Like, I do think it's kind of silly that she keeps insisting to talk like we would in the modern era, and she always has to like explain to these people who are living in this high fantasy world what it means, and she can never like wrap her head around like not to use slogans like that. And it is kind of annoying how often she swears. Like, no, I don't think anybody swears that much. But I wasn't nearly as annoyed by this as other people. I actually really liked Frey as a character, despite her more corny dialogue. She really does not like helping anybody, which kind of makes sense given her history as an orphan and the system has probably failed her, but she doesn't have that like turnaround hero moment very often. Like, as far as the story goes, she will always end up helping somebody because in the end it will benefit her as well, or maybe she's seeking revenge. But for most of the story, she is pretty self-serving, and I don't think a lot of people enjoy that as a main character. I do kind of like how when Cuff is talking to Frey, it also comes out of the PlayStation 5 speaker. I know I always just rave about these features for the PlayStation 5, but I just think they're so cool because you're hearing Cuff in the speaker on the TV, but then you're also hearing him through the speaker of the controller, and so it's kind of like he's talking all around you, and I think it really reflects that like he's talking in your head, because like nobody else can hear Cuff, only you can because you're wearing him. I also really like the HD rumble that it has in the controller, because when you're using spells, it will reflect that in the vibration of your controller. Like, there's one spell that I really liked where you're just like constantly shooting all these little pebbles at an enemy, and like your controller feels like a Tommy gun or something. It was very loud though, so I definitely had to turn that off when it's early in the morning and people are asleep in my house. One thing that is kind of weird about the story and the cinematics here is the cinematics will always fade out and then they'll fade back in, and you haven't, like, no time has passed. You haven't changed locations or anything like that. Like, normally when you're watching a TV show or a cinematic or something, it fades out when, just to skip, like, when you're going to a new location or some time has passed, but, like, you'll be in the same moment, and it almost just, like, fades out whenever it's transitioning between scenes, and it feels disjointed. It, like, disconnects you from the cinematic that you're watching because it continuously just fades out and then fades back in real time. This game is also broken up by chapters. There's, I think, 12 or 13 chapters in the game, and the length between these chapters is just all over the place. Like, I think when you're maybe 2 or 3 hours in, you're already in chapter 4 or 5. Like, some chapters are 10 minutes long, other chapters are 2 hours long, and so it's really just like all over the place. And I wouldn't use the chapters as a marker based on like how far along you are in the game. It really is like a shorter open world game though. One of the shortest ones that I've played. It took me about 20 hours to roll the credits. Now granted, like I said, I was about halfway into the game before I stopped doing all of the side stuff, and I basically just do the side stuff that were along the way to my main destination to progress the main story. But I mean, most open world games like this are 40, 50 hour plus, and I do tend to get burnt out if the game like this going on too long, and so I must give this game points for keeping the game shorter and more compact, at least in terms of the story. That is to say, though, I do think that this game wouldn't feel as tedious if there were more story beats in between, or something to break up the gameplay from just exploring this sprawling, barren world, because the story actually was pretty interesting, you know, like a land covered in this corruption, and there are these crazy Tanta's royal witch ladies that you have to go and defeat. But it's just like there's so much time in between you're at the city and you get an objective, and then you go and do that objective. Almost to the point where sometimes I forget why we are doing what we're doing. Another really unique thing about this game that I have to give it props for is 95% of the main characters are female, which I think is really interesting because that isn't something that you normally see in a lot of video games. And so it was a refreshing take that basically like all the people of power are women. You know, I was a little nervous going into this game, but I found it for 20 bucks. Online, all you see are complaints about this game. People hate this game, and I really don't think that's fair for this game. And I think it's because just the slow burn at the beginning and phrase dialogue. I think those are really like the main reasons that people don't like this game, but if you give it a shot, I think there's a lot to offer here in terms of the unique combat. It is fun, like when you finally do get all your different abilities and spells, you really do feel like a powerful spellcaster that's like launching all over the place and throwing all these different elements. Once you really master the combat system, it really does feel fun and clean and cool. That's not to say that the combat system is perfect. I do have my gripes. For instance, it is difficult using your offensive abilities and trying to dodge a bunch of projectiles when you are encountering a ton of enemies. And the system is kind of clunky trying to navigate what spells you want to use at what time. It kind of like slows down time while it pulls out this radial menu, and you have to like visually pick what spell you want to use given the moment. And so that can get tedious trying to dodge all these projectiles and choose and use your spells. It's like they were almost there to a really amazing combat system, and it didn't quite nail it, at least in my opinion, but there's still something there. Same with the traversal system. Like the traversal system, the magic parkour as they call it, it's not perfect in its execution, but like the idea is an interesting idea. The combat and traversal is interesting enough to at least play through the game and experience them, as clunky as they may be. Overall, I think I'm going to give this game a 3 out of 5, but it's a high 3. Like I was debating between 3 and 4, and ultimately, yeah, it is a 3, but it's up there. It's like close to being a 4. And if you can pick this game up for 20 bucks like I did, I definitely think you should give it a shot. Like play at least 3 hours when it finally releases you out in the open world and you can really play around with the parkour and the combat system. I don't know, unless swearing really bugs you, because there is a lot of swearing here. So if you're the type of person that can't stand swearing, I would stay away from this game. Frey definitely has a potty mouth. Well guys, that's it for me. Let me know if you have any questions or comments about Forspoken, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. Otherwise, I'll talk to you later. Bye!
Oh, it likes me.
Very good, very